It happened in the kitchen on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was standing on my tiptoes, reaching for the top shelf of the cabinet, rearranging dishes that hadn't been touched in years. The faint hum of the radio filled the space, one of those easy listening stations I'd always kept on for company. It was supposed to be a simple task, one of the dozens I used to fill the quiet spaces in my day. Then Evan walked in. I didn't hear him at first. His steps were quiet, deliberate, the way they always were. I only noticed him when I turned to grab the next stack of plates and saw him leaning casually against the counter, his arms crossed, a small smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice warm, teasing. "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly, my cheeks flushing as I realized how flustered I sounded. He stepped closer, reaching past me for the glass on the shelf above my head. The movement was smooth, natural, but it brought him so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the earthy warmth of the rain outside. "Here," he said, handing me the glass, his voice quieter now. "Thanks," I murmured, but my voice faltered, my breath catching as his hand brushed against mine. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air between us shifted, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. His eyes met mine, and the look in them made my chest tighten. It wasn't just a glance, it was searching, deliberate, like he was seeing something in me that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I stepped back, breaking the moment, and turned quickly to set the glass on the counter. My heart was pounding, and I hated how obvious it felt. "You've been busy," he said, his tone easy as he leaned against the counter. "It keeps me out of trouble," I replied, forcing a smile. "Trouble?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "You don't strike me as the troublemaking type." I laughed, the sound more nervous than I intended. "Not anymore, at least." He didn't say anything, just watched me with that same faint smirk, his gaze steady in a way that made my pulse quicken. Evan had only been living with me for a month, but his presence in the house had already turned my carefully curated world upside down. When my husband, Richard, passed away 6 years ago, I'd spent the first few years drowning in the quiet. The house had been too big, too empty, and I'd filled it with routines and distractions, gardening, cooking, cleaning, anything to keep myself from thinking too much. It worked for a while, but then Evan came back. He'd called one evening out of the blue, his voice hesitant as he explained his situation. His tech job in Seattle had fallen through, his lease was up, and he needed a place to land for a while until he figured out his next steps. I could still remember the way he'd paused after asking, as though he were afraid I might say no. The next morning, the storm was gone, leaving the world outside fresh and quiet. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, glinting off the rain-soaked garden, and for a moment, everything felt strangely normal. But as I stood at the sink, rinsing my coffee cup, the weight of the night before settled heavily on me. My reflection in the window was as familiar as always. But there was something different about the woman staring back at me. Something softer, something unsure. I had crossed a line, and though I didn't regret it, I couldn't ignore the questions clawing at the edges of my mind. What happens now? I didn't hear him come into the room, but I felt his presence before I turned around. Evan was standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled. He looked younger in the morning light, less guarded, and for a moment I let myself just take him in. "Morning," he said softly, his voice careful. "Morning," I replied, setting the cup down and wiping my hands on a dish towel. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything we hadn't said yet. He stepped further into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were testing the waters. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his tone gentle. I nodded, though the truth was I wasn't sure how much of the night I'd actually spent sleeping. "Did you?" "Not much," he admitted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He moved to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee before leaning against it, his gaze fixed on me. "Are you okay?" The question was simple, but it carried so much weight, and I felt my chest tighten under the pressure of it. "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice trembling slightly. He nodded as though he'd expected that answer. "That's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to figure everything out right now." His words were a relief, and I felt some of the tension ease from my shoulders. Last night, I began, but the words caught in my throat. Was real, he finished for me, his voice firm but kind. I looked up at him, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. It's not that simple, Evan. I know, he said, stepping closer. But it doesn't mean it wasn't real. He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine where it rested on the counter. The touch was soft, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let my fingers curl around his, the warmth of his hand grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to know, he said gently. We'll figure it out. Together. His words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. This is scary, I whispered. I know, he said, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand, but you don't have to do it alone. We stood there in the quiet, the sunlight streaming through the window, the sound of the world outside distant and muffled. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. A fragile, tentative kind of hope that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone in. I'm not asking for anything from you, he said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence. I just want you to know that I'm here. For as long as you'll let me be. His words stayed with me long after he left the room, echoing in my mind as I sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the garden. For years I'd told myself that I was fine on my own, that I didn't need anyone else. I'd built a life around that belief, one that was quiet and safe, but empty in ways I hadn't let myself acknowledge. But now, with Evan's words still lingering in the air, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. Was it possible to let myself feel again? To let myself be vulnerable? The thought scared me, but it also filled me with something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. When I finally stood, the house was quiet, the weight of the night before still settling over it like a blanket. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if I was ready to face what came next. But as I looked out at the garden, the sunlight glinting off the rain-soaked leaves, I felt a small, tentative flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to let myself be happy. Maybe, just maybe, it was okay to take a chance. Of course I hadn't. He was family. Well, technically. I had married Richard when Evan was already 16, a tall, gangly teenager with a quick wit and a quiet charm. We'd gotten along easily enough, though he'd always kept a respectful distance, never quite letting me in. After Richard's death, we drifted even further apart, our occasional phone calls polite but distant. Now, seeing him as an adult, I could barely reconcile the boy I remembered with the man standing in front of me. He was confident in a way that felt effortless. His sharp features softened by an easy smile that seemed to disarm everyone he met. But there was a depth to him, a quiet vulnerability that he rarely let slip, and it tugged at something in me I couldn't explain. You've been quiet today, Evan said, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, startled by the observation. Have I? He nodded, his gaze steady. Yeah. Something on your mind? I hesitated, unsure how to answer. How could I explain the jumble of emotions his presence had stirred in me? The way he seemed to unravel years of carefully constructed solitude with nothing more than a smile. Just thinking about how much needs to be done around here, I said finally, deflecting. Let me know if you need help, he said, his voice warm but casual. Thanks, I replied, turning back to the cabinet to avoid his gaze. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me in the kitchen. The warmth in his voice, the subtle weight of his presence. It wasn't just about him, it was about what he represented. For years I'd told myself that I didn't need anyone else, that I was content with the life I'd built. But now, with Evan here, I wasn't so sure. Something had shifted, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but his face lingered in my mind, and for the first time in years, I felt the faint stirrings of something I thought I'd lost forever. The days that followed felt like walking through a maze, each turn more confusing than the last. Evan was everywhere. Not in an invasive way, but in a way that made it impossible to ignore him. I'd wake up to find him in the kitchen, sipping coffee at the table, his hair messy from sleep, and his bare feet tapping lightly against the floor. He always greeted me with the same easy smile, the kind that seemed to linger long after he'd left the room. Then there were the small things. The way he reached for plates while we set the table, his hand brushing against mine as if by accident. The quiet moments where he'd catch my eye and hold my gaze just a second too long. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into every look, every word. But the truth was he had unsettled something in me. Something I couldn't quite name. One afternoon, we found ourselves in the garden. The weather had cooled slightly, the crispness of early autumn creeping into the air. I was tending to the roses, carefully trimming away the dead leaves, when I heard his voice behind me. "Need a hand?" I turned to see him standing at the edge of the patio, his hands tucked into his pockets. He looked casual, relaxed, but there was a warmth in his eyes that made my pulse quicken. "I've got it," I said quickly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. He didn't listen. Instead, he stepped closer, crouching beside me and reaching for the pruning shears. "I'll do the heavy lifting," he said, his tone teasing. I sighed, handing them over. "You're stubborn, you know that?" "Must run in the family," he replied with a grin. We worked side by side in comfortable silence, the soft rustle of leaves and the chirp of birds filling the air. At one point I reached for a fallen rose, and our hands brushed against each other. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. But he had. "Sorry," he said softly, his voice quiet but deliberate. "It's fine," I replied, turning back to the roses. But the moment lingered, the air between us charged with something unspoken. Later that evening, we ended up in the kitchen again, cleaning up after dinner. It had become something of a routine, me washing the dishes, him drying them. It was a small gesture, but one I appreciated more than I let on. "You don't have to help, you know," I said as I handed him a plate. "I know," he replied, his tone light, "but I like being useful." I smiled despite myself, focusing on the warm water running over my hands. "You've always been that way." "Maybe," he said, leaning against the counter as he dried the plate, "but I think you bring it out in me." I glanced at him, startled by the comment. His expression was unreadable, his gaze steady as he watched me. "Don't look so surprised," he said with a faint smile. "You're easy to be around." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I focused on the sink, scrubbing the same plate longer than necessary. "I mean it," he added, his voice softer now. "You make this place feel like home." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my chest tighten. For years, I'd convinced myself that I was fine on my own, that the life I'd built was enough. But in that moment, hearing those words from him, I realized how much I'd been craving connection, even if I hadn't let myself admit it. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. The next day, the tension between us seemed to grow. It wasn't overt. Nothing had been said or done to cross any lines, but it was there, in the way he lingered in the doorway while I read on the couch, or the way his hand brushed against mine when we passed each other in the hall. "I didn't hear you come in," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "The storm woke me up," he replied, stepping further into the room. His gaze shifted to the matches in my hand, and his lips curved into a faint smile. "You okay?" "Just startled," I said, straightening. "Let me," he said, reaching out to take the matches from me. Our hands brushed as he did, his fingers grazing mine in a way that felt unreasonably intimate. I froze, the air between us suddenly thick with something unspoken. He struck the match, the sudden flare of light illuminating his face, and for a moment I was struck by how easily he seemed to fill the room. He lit the candle and set it on the counter, the warm glow casting soft shadows on the walls. "There," he said, his voice quiet. "Thanks," I murmured, but my words felt hollow. My chest was tight, my thoughts tangled in a way I couldn't untangle. "Storms like this always make the house feel different," he said, leaning against the counter. His tone was casual, but his eyes were on me, steady and watchful. "Different how?" I asked, grateful for the distraction. "Quieter," he said after a moment. "Like it's holding its breath." I nodded, understanding what he meant more than I wanted to admit. He didn't move, didn't say anything else, and the silence stretched between us until it felt almost unbearable. "Do you want some tea?" I asked, the words tumbling out too quickly. "Sure," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. I busied myself with the kettle, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between us. But even as I moved around the kitchen, I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unrelenting. When the tea was ready, I handed him a mug, careful not to let our hands touch. He accepted it with a quiet thanks, his fingers brushing against mine anyway. We sat at the table, the candle flickering between us, the storm raging outside. He leaned back in his chair, his hands wrapped around the mug, his expression thoughtful. "You're quiet tonight," he said finally. "Just tired," I replied, though the words felt hollow. "You've been saying that a lot lately," he said, his tone soft but probing. I didn't know how to respond, so I took a sip of my tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest. "I worry about you, you know," he said after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. His words caught me off guard, and I looked up at him, startled by the seriousness in his tone. "Why?" "Because you don't let anyone in," he said simply. "You keep everything bottled up like you're afraid to let anyone see the real you." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew he was right. "You don't have to do that with me," he said, his gaze locked on mine. "You don't have to pretend." His words made my chest ache, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "It's not that simple," I said quietly. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady. "Because I'm scared," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He nodded, his expression softening. "I know, but you don't have to be." His hand reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. The gesture was simple, but it sent a shiver through me, and I felt my breath hitch. "Evan," I began, but my voice faltered. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything. I want you to know that I'm here. For you. No matter what." His words lingered in the air, and I felt the weight of them settle over me. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted finally, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said, his thumb brushing lightly against the back of my hand. "You just have to let yourself feel it." The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, the sound of the rain and thunder drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I let myself see the vulnerability in his eyes, the quiet sincerity in his voice. It scared me, but it also made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. "Can we just—" I trailed off, unsure of what I was even asking. "Take it one step at a time," he finished for me, his lips curving into a small, understanding smile. I nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. When he finally stood, his hand lingering on mine for just a moment before he turned to leave, I felt the air rush back into my lungs. "Good night, Marianne," he said softly, his voice warm and steady. "Good night," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As he disappeared down the hall, I stayed where I was, staring at the candle's flickering flame. My heart was still pounding, and my thoughts were still tangled. But for the first time in years, I felt a faint glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep running from this. The morning after the storm brought a strange kind of clarity. The air outside was crisp and clean, the sunlight breaking through the lingering gray clouds to illuminate the garden. Inside, the house felt quieter than usual, as though it too were holding its breath. I spent most of the morning in the kitchen, my hands busy kneading dough for a loaf of bread. The rhythm of the task was soothing, and I focused on it with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, desperate for something to drown out the whirlwind of thoughts in my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Evan had looked at me the night before. The quiet sincerity in his eyes, the warmth in his voice, the gentle brush of his hand against mine. He didn't make an appearance until nearly noon, and when he did, it was with the same easy confidence that seemed to come so naturally to him. He walked into the kitchen barefoot, his hair slightly messy, wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but casual. "Morning," I replied, my tone brisk as I turned back to the counter. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed as he watched me. "You've been up early." "I had things to do," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Looks like you're doing everything," he said with a faint smile, nodding toward the counter where the dough sat. "You always do." His words struck a nerve, and I turned to face him, my hands still dusted with flour. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you take on too much," he said simply, his gaze steady. "You're always trying to do everything yourself." "Someone has to," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Why does it always have to be you? He asked, stepping into the room. I didn't have an answer for that, so I turned back to the dough, pressing my hands into it with more force than necessary. You don't have to do it all alone, he said softly, his voice closer now. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt my chest tighten. I'm used to it, I said finally, my voice quieter now. That doesn't mean it's right, he replied. I froze, my hands stilling against the dough as his words sank in. He was close now, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, and when I turned to look at him, the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to keep shutting people out. The vulnerability in his voice broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, the words tumbled out. You don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. I can't let myself feel, he finished for me, his tone gentle but insistent. I nodded, my chest tight with the weight of everything I'd been holding back. You don't have to be afraid, he said, his hand reaching out to rest lightly on my arm. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I felt my defenses begin to crumble. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension between us thick and unspoken. I don't know how to do this, I admitted, my voice barely audible. You don't have to figure it all out right now, he said softly. Just let yourself feel it. That's all I'm asking. His words were a lifeline, pulling me toward something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Evan, I began, but my voice faltered as he stepped closer, his hand sliding down to clasp mine. It's okay, he said, his thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. We can take it slow. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the oven timer going off, the sharp beep cutting through the quiet. I stepped back quickly, breaking the connection, and turned to pull the tray of bread from the oven. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was still standing there, his expression unreadable. Thank you, I said quietly, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for. He smiled faintly, his eyes soft. Anytime. That evening, the tension between us reached its peak. We were sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in each of our hands, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. The conversation had started light, small talk about the weather, his plans for the week, but it didn't stay that way for long. You've been distant today, he said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. I'm not distant, I replied, though the words felt hollow even to me. He raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smile. You're a terrible liar, Marianne. I sighed, setting my glass on the coffee table. It's just a lot to process, I admitted. I know, he said softly, his voice laced with understanding. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he met my gaze. You don't have to have all the answers, he said. But you have to stop running from this. This? I asked, my voice trembling. Us, he said simply. The word hung in the air, and I felt my breath catch. There's no us, I said quickly, shaking my head. There could be, he replied, his voice steady. I looked away, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. It's not that simple, I whispered. It doesn't have to be, he said, his hand reaching out to brush lightly against mine. It just has to be real. The sincerity in his voice, the quiet intensity in his eyes, made my resolve falter, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. Evan, It's okay, he said softly, his hand closing gently around mine. We'll figure it out together. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his words echoed in my mind. We'll figure it out together. For the first time in years, the thought didn't scare me. It was late that night when it finally happened, the moment I'd been running from for weeks. The storm that had passed earlier seemed to have left something charged in the air, and though the house was quiet, my mind wouldn't stop racing. I was in the kitchen again, leaning against the counter with a glass of water, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. The day had been heavy, too many words left unsaid, too many moments where the tension between us had felt too much to bear. And though I'd tried to ignore it, to push it down, it lingered, pressing against my chest with every passing hour. I didn't hear him at first. He moved so quietly, his steps barely audible against the wooden floor. When I turned, he was standing in the doorway, his hair mussed, his expression unreadable in the dim light. You're still up, he said softly, his voice cutting through the stillness. I couldn't sleep, I replied, setting the glass down on the counter. He stepped into the room, the faint scent of rain still clinging to him. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, and yet there was something about him, something unguarded, almost vulnerable, that made my chest tighten. Me neither, he said, leaning against the counter opposite me. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us thick and unspoken. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unrelenting, and though I told myself to look away, I couldn't. What's keeping you up? He asked finally, his voice low. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. Just a lot on my mind, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Is it about me? He asked, his tone gentle but direct. The question hit me like a wave, and I felt my breath catch. I didn't know how to answer, didn't know how to put into words the mess of emotions swirling inside me. Evan, I began, but the words faltered. It's okay, he said softly, stepping closer. You don't have to say anything, He paused, his gaze searching mine, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I just need you to know that I care about you, more than I probably should, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't. His confession hung in the air, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. This is complicated, I said, my voice trembling. I know, he said, his tone steady, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. I shook my head, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. You're my stepson, Evan. This isn't supposed to happen. I'm not your son, he said quietly, his voice firm but gentle. Not really. And even if I was, that wouldn't change how I feel about you. His words broke something in me, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely audible. You don't have to know, he said, his hand reaching out to brush lightly against my cheek. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt myself leaning into it before I could stop myself. I'm scared, I whispered, my voice breaking. I know, he said softly, his hand sliding down to cup my face. But you don't have to be, not with me. His words made my chest ache, and before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was tentative at first, hesitant and searching, but it quickly deepened, his arms wrapping around me as though he were afraid to let go. His hands slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him. The warmth of his touch chasing away the fear and doubt that had been weighing me down for so long. When we pulled apart, our foreheads rested against each other, our breaths mingling in the quiet. Tell me to stop, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. If this isn't what you want, just say the word and I'll walk away. I looked at him, my chest tight with a mix of fear and longing. I don't want you to stop, I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His lips found mine again, more confident this time, and I felt his hand slide up to cradle my face, his touch both firm and reverent. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an unraveling, a release of everything we'd been holding back. He guided me toward the couch, his movements slow and deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself fall into the moment, into him, into the warmth and security of his embrace. His hands moved with quiet reverence, exploring the curves of my body in a way that made me feel cherished, wanted, alive. My own hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping tightly as the intensity of the moment threatened to overwhelm me. Are you okay? He asked softly, his voice breaking through the haze. Yes, I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of nerves and desire. His lips found mine again, and for the first time in years, I let myself surrender completely. It wasn't just about the physical connection, it was the way he looked at me, his gaze filled with an intensity that made my chest ache. It was the way he whispered my name, soft and reverent, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. And when it was over, when we lay tangled together on the couch, the faint glow of the candlelight casting soft shadows across our skin, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Hope. Are you okay? He asked again, his voice softer this time. I think so, I said, my head resting against his chest. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his arms tightening around me. I meant what I said, he murmured. I'm here for as long as you'll let me be. His words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. This is scary, I admitted, my voice barely audible. I know, he said gently, but you don't have to do it alone. As the storm outside began to fade, the thunder growing distant, I lay there in his arms, the sound of his heartbeat steadied beneath my ear. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was enough. And for now, that was all I needed.